It was really interesting. Given Claudia's given such a sort of wide-reaching overview of Iconoclasm's history, I won't repeat that. Sorry.
Thank you.
But I think there are three distinct but interlinked trends happening at the moment, and trying to discuss them under the same breath is not really possible. So I'm going to try and sort of separate them out. The first one is the tearing down of statues that has obviously sort of been going since the beginning of time, but in this country, in the public eye, first sort of started happening in 2020 around Black Lives Matter. And that seems to be quite a standard and obvious form of iconoclasm. The tearing down of the Colston statue meets sort of every historical parallel with iconoclasm in a religious sense. It was pulled down in a very sort of graphic and public way. It is now displayed on its sort of side with graffiti, just as sort of slashed tapestries were displayed in the Byzantine period. And it was done so because of a sort of zealotry ideology that captured a lot of people. And that's very obviously an iconoclastic thing. The second thing we're seeing happen, as has been discovered, is the vandalism of paintings. And I think that's slightly more difficult to understand through the lens of iconoclasm. The first thing to note on this, which is sort of slightly depressing, is Just Stop Oil here have had their main demand met. They've been going for a few years. They were set up because they wanted new oil and gas licenses suspended. And in a move that will make this whole country much poorer, that was one of the first concessions that Ed Miliband made in power. And I'm not saying he did that to sort of save any more statues having been thrown at them. But it is worth noting that Just Stop Oil are not an insurgent minority group that is separate to sort of the political elite. The views of our Secretary of State for Energy and the views of these very young activists appear to be the same. And that's worth noting, and that is a big difference in movements in the past. And it's interesting, we've had the Rokeby Venus slashing mentioned twice today, and I think I have a bit less sympathy for the action of the suffragettes than JJ. But it is at least worth noting this was an insurgent group that at this point had no access to the elite class, and Just Stop Oil really do. What I find particularly interesting about this, I mean, I'm saying recent trend, and these are things that have been happening for thousands of years, but, you know, this new type of painting vandalism that has sprung up in the last few years, mostly done by 3 or 4 groups, Just Stop Oil, Youth Demand, and Palestine Action, who, for what it's worth, all have exactly the same members. I think if you're a slightly disenfranchised 23-year-old living sort of on your student loan and parents' money, you join all of them at once and you do all of their different projects. So we are talking about very, very few people who feel so strongly about our nation's art, but it's worth noting. They very rarely set out to damage the artwork. And this, I'm not defending Just Stop Oil at all. I think they're an awful group. I think the law should come down strongly on them. But it's interesting trying to pick apart the way they manage their protests, because they always have a statement after saying, we've only damaged the glass, this papering over will come off. Yeah. There's no, this statue isn't in damage, which is obviously very different to the Rokeby Venus. Yeah. And I'd love to hear from the audience, because I struggle a bit with why this is being done. Because on a sort of first principle, what's clearly happened is they've tried to pick a sacred cow, which the large majority of the public who aren't with them care about or be outraged by. And as you perfectly put it themselves, I think art galleries show the best and the worst of ourselves. They encapsulate what we're proud of in the culture. And by storming into one of them and damaging the artwork on display, they're taking that away from us, and they're co-opting all of that, the value we hold for the history of art, for their cause. But then we have to ask why they're not destroying paintings in the same way that the Colston statue or statues across the UK have been destroyed. And that is quite interesting to me. It could just be moral cowardice and like a fundamental awareness that that would be a terrible thing to do, or a fear of the law coming down far more strongly on them, or the fines. But it does characterise the protest quite strangely. I found the Stonehenge discussion very interesting about this, because they'd thrown some coloured cornflower on Stonehenge before the eclipse, and then put out a statement saying this will wash away in the rain. And some experts on the issue came out and said, actually, you've killed some really rare species of lichen that have been there thousands of years. And they seemed genuinely quite sheepish about that. So I do think, you know, if we're going to try and think about what Just Stop Oil are trying to do and why they're trying to do it, those are two things that you need to bear in mind, that their views are not that disparate or separate to the elite class in Britain today. They're different. I think they're disparate to the majority of people, but they've got a direct line to the elite class. They're often funded by people quite near power. And the second thing is that they don't seem to be doing the sort of damage to icons that ancient iconoclasts or iconoclasts in Venice did in the past. And then there's a third type of iconoclasm, and it's a type that I find oddly most disturbing, even though I think it sort of goes under the radar much more, and that's the rebranding or denigrating of our history for modern audiences. That's, you keep the painting, but you pop a little plaque underneath saying it's terribly offensive, and this gallery doesn't stand by any of the things that painter did. And I think that that's been one of the most widespread and quiet developments in recent years. I think I was about this panel because I was very critical of the decision to rebrand the Hay Wain painting as a sort of highly privileged painting that was sort of deeply racist, because I do think that it's fundamentally bad art history. But when we're looking at that, again, we're not looking at a small protest group. We're looking at members of the elite classes criticising or changing or taking down art history. And you mentioned the changing of paintings in Downing Street, and I think, obviously, that is not a protest movement. The Prime Minister and Rachel Reeves have been doing that amongst themselves. The National Portrait Gallery rehang, I thought, was broadly quite fair, but saw some good statues confined to storage because of the views of the artists that ran them. At the National Maritime Museum, there's a quite good exhibition on slavery. It's about 20 years old. But there's now also a sign at the front saying this exhibition isn't good enough and doesn't fit with our values, and we'll be changing it soon because we're very sorry about the racism of it. And I wonder if that is actually that's the most insidious modern conception of iconoclasm. We've civilized ourselves beyond, apart from in certain moments of protest, the pulling down or the slashing of statues, and even the protesters are scared to throw paint on a portrait. But our elite classes, and I completely agree with Claudia, I think iconoclasm is generally an authoritarian, top-down approach to history. Our elite classes are quietly denigrating our history. They're quietly doing quite bad analysis of what's happened. And they're quietly changing or removing your ability to understand this nation's past. And that's what, in the work on the arts I do, that's what scares me. And that's, I think, the thing I would really like to tackle in this panel. But looking forward to hearing other thoughts.
Yeah, great.